$650, that is the entry price for the smallest production mini Quonset model on the market today. The corrugated steel panels ship flat. The ribs bolt together without welding. A two-person crew with no construction. Background has raised a complete shell in a single weekend. The United States Navy built more than 150,000 of these structures during World War II because the arch geometry was the strongest, lightest, fastest shelter shape engineering had ever produced under field conditions. That was 1941. The design has not needed revision since. And yet if you search for tiny home builds right now, you will find shipping containers, trailer platforms, and prefab shed kits. Almost never the arch something sitting in plain sight for 80 years remains invisible to the people who need it most. So why has the most proven low-cost shelter shape in American history never made it onto the tiny home shortlist? $52,000. That is the current median price for a finished tiny home on a trailer chassis from a production builder in the United States. Not a custom build, not a premium finish. The base model, standard trim before delivery, before the land, before any utility hookup. 5 years ago, that number was closer to $35,000. The trend is moving in the wrong direction. The regulatory environment for small off-grid structures has been shifting in your favor. California, Montana, and Texas have all loosened their accessory dwelling unit rules since 2020, and rural county codes across the South and the Intermountain West have long exempted structures under a specific square footage threshold from the permit process entirely, provided they are not connected to municipal water or sewer. The window is open. The cost problem is still the obstacle. And here's the question most people shopping for a small build never think to ask. The question is not whether you can afford a tiny home. The question is whether you are pricing the right kind of structure. Because a structure that could close that gap has been sitting in government surplus listings and agricultural supply catalogs for the better part of a century. Almost nobody in the tiny home conversation has noticed it. And the reason why it takes you somewhere you would not expect. In 1941, the United States Navy faced a specific engineering problem. It needed a shelter that could be manufactured in bulk, broken down into panels, loaded onto a cargo ship, and assembled on a Pacific Island beach by a construction crew working against a deadline measured in hours, not days. The structure had to be strong enough to stand through tropical storms, light enough to move without heavy equipment, and simple enough that any man with a wrench could put it together without blueprints. The answer came from the George A. Fuller Company, working under a Navy contract at Quonset Point Naval Air Station in Rhode Island. The name stuck. By the end of the war, approximately 150,000 Quonset huts had been built and deployed across every theater of operation, from the Aleutian Islands to North Africa to the islands of the South Pacific. Field hospitals, aircraft maintenance hangars, barracks, supply depots, the arch served all of them. After the war ended, surplus units sold at government auction for as little as $1,000 each. They spread across farms throughout the Midwest and the Great Plains, repurposed as equipment sheds, grain storage buildings, and in some cases, as the primary structures on small rural properties. A number of them are still standing today. The many models entering the civilian market are direct descendants of that original design. The corrugated steel arch, the bolt-together rib assembly, the absence of any internal load-bearing wall. All of it traces back to the same engineering logic the Navy put to work in 1941. This is not a trend product. It is an 80-year-old solution that finally got a smaller trim size. Picture an egg. Press down on the top of the shell with your thumb, and it holds. Press on the flat end, and it cracks. The difference is not the material. It is the shape. The curve distributes force continuously along the whole structure, rather than concentrating it at any single point. That is why arch bridges have outlasted flat ones for thousands of years, and it is the same principle the Navy was applying in 1941. Now, picture a sheet of paper lying flat across two stacked books. Lay a pencil across the middle, and the paper sags through immediately. Fold that same sheet lengthwise into a sharp ridge, and lay the pencil across again. It holds. The corrugation adds stiffness in both directions simultaneously, without adding any material weight. A mini Quonset transfers its roof load down those corrugated steel ribs to the foundation continuously along the curve, without needing a single internal support column. The shell is a structure. Now consider what happens at every wooden stud in a conventional wall, which conducts heat. At each stud, and in a standard 2x6 wall, they appear every 16 inches across the entire exterior. The insulation layer is interrupted. Heat moves through those vertical stripes of framing from the warm interior to the cold exterior with almost no resistance. Building scientists call this thermal bridging, and it is not a small effect. Research from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory found it can reduce the real-world thermal performance of a well-insulated stud wall by up to 30% compared to its rated value. A mini Quonset has none of that. The curved interior surface accepts rigid foam board or spray foam in a continuous, unbroken layer from floor to ridge. There is no framing to interrupt it, no vertical stripe of conduction running through the insulation every 1.5 feet. And that changes what the real-world performance numbers actually mean, which is what the documented builds show. Take one documented case from a man in rural Montana who completed a 10x16 mini Quonset build. Shell, rigid foam insulation on the interior curve, a salvaged exterior door from a Habitat for Humanity, Restore in Missoula, a pier foundation of 12 cinder blocks, and a basic off-grid electrical system, for a total material cost of $2,740. Named state, named footprint, named total. The $650 entry price is real, but it covers the shell panels only. Delivery from most manufacturers adds $200 to $600 depending on distance. A cinder block pier foundation runs $80 to $150 in materials. Rigid foam board sufficient to line a 10x16 interior costs $200 to $350 at retail, and considerably less when sourced from construction site waste bins, which generate cut-off foam board in quantity on any active commercial job. The honest total for a livable, insulated structure built by a disciplined man sourcing materials intelligently lands between $1,800 and $3,500. Still less than the deposit on a production tiny home. Read that again. A livable insulated shell. 1 weekend of assembly. Under $3,500 total. No welding, no crane, no specialized trades. But here is what makes this larger than one man in Montana. A housing outreach coordinator in Ravalli County, Montana, documented 3 separate owner-built arch structures on private rural land within a 40-mile radius, each completed by a different man with no prior construction experience, and none of whom had any contact with each other. Each had independently arrived at the same surplus kit sourcing pipeline, the same rigid foam board salvage method, and the same county permit threshold research. A social worker in rural Lemhi County, Idaho, described the same convergence. Men learning the complete foundation and assembly process from conversations at food bank distribution lines and Saturday church breakfasts, passing hand-drawn wiring diagrams from one person to the next on notebook paper. The knowledge spreads the way survival knowledge has always traveled, not through programs or publications, but through the people who needed it first. Now, I want to be straight with you, because being straight with you is the whole point. The $650 figure is real. It is the current entry price of the smallest production mini Quonset model from several active manufacturers, and it covers the corrugated steel arch panels, the ridge ribs, and the fasteners. It does not cover delivery, a foundation, insulation, a door, or any system for water, power, or cooking. A finished, livable structure built by a man's source of materials intelligently costs between $1,800 and $3,500. That is still the honest number, and it is still remarkable. But anyone who tells you that you can move in for $650 is not accounting for the full build. The arch is also not a house in the conventional sense. The interior floor area of a 10x12 model is approximately 120 square feet, enough for one person and a functional set of systems, workable for 2 people who have planned to lay out carefully and not a family home. Anyone who presents it as one is selling something. Moisture management is not optional. An uninsulated or poorly vapor-sealed arch in any climate with seasonal humidity will develop condensation on the interior steel surface within 1 season. That condensation destroys insulation with finishes and anything fabric inside the structure within a year. A 50-foot roll of 6 mil plastic sheeting costs $20 at any hardware store. Stapled to the interior framing before the insulation goes up, it prevents the problem entirely. Skipping it is how a great build becomes a failed one before the first winter is out. The honest version of this build is still the most cost-effective entry point in the small shelter market, but the homework is what keeps it that way. Consider what happens when a man walks into a rural county permit office with plans for a mini Quonset he intends to occupy as a primary residence. The clerk has approved hundreds of stick-frame sheds, several manufactured home placements, and a handful of conventional ADU builds. He has never seen an arch form submitted as a dwelling. What follows is not illegal, but it is not smooth. Most rural county codes exempt structures under 120 to 200 square feet from the permit process when they are not connected to municipal utilities. A 10 by 12 mini Quonset at 120 square feet falls inside that threshold in most jurisdictions across Texas, Montana, and Tennessee, but the exemption language was written with storage sheds in mind. Whether a structure within the threshold can be legally inhabited depends on how each individual inspector reads language that was never written to answer that question. The financing gap is more absolute. A lender wants a permanent foundation, a recognized residential designation, and comparable sales nearby. A corrugated steel arch on cinder blocks satisfies none of those criteria by any conventional underwriting standard. And then there is the appraiser. In 2022, a rural workforce housing initiative in Blaine County, Idaho placed a series of owner-built arch structures on private land as part of a county pilot program. The appraiser assigned to evaluate the structures had no comparable arch sales in the county database. He valued each one using conventional stick-built storage sheds as the benchmark because that was the only category his system recognized. For years of occupancy, documented energy performance, and verified structural integrity were worth nothing in comparison. The system had no box to put them in. Nobody designed this to exclude the arch. They just left the default exactly where it was. And the default has always been the most familiar and most expensive option. So, is a mini Quonset illegal to live in? Here's the honest answer, and it is more useful than the myth. No, there is no building code in the United States that prohibits a corrugated steel arch structure. There is no federal regulation that bars occupancy. In rural jurisdictions where the footprint falls below the permit exemption threshold and the structure is not connected to municipal utilities, a man can place a properly insulated, vapor-sealed arch on a pier foundation with a landowner permission and occupy it legally without a permit, a mortgage, or a building inspector's stamp. The resistance is not legal. It is institutional. An inspector hesitates not because the written code bars the arch, but because he has approved 10,000 stick frame walls and perhaps 2 arch structures, and unfamiliarity costs him time. A lender declines not because the law requires it, but because his underwriting template has no feel for a corrugated steel dwelling on a pier foundation. An appraiser in Blaine County reaches for the shed comparison not because he is wrong, but because comparable arch sales do not exist in his database. So the nearest familiar category wins by default. That is friction. And friction, unlike a prohibition, is something you can plan around. The men who built livable arch structures across rural Montana and Idaho and Tennessee did not fight the system. They learned the written rules, identified exactly where those rules ended, and built in the space that remained. The question is not whether you can build one. The question is whether you are willing to do the preparation that makes the friction manageable before the first panel arrives. Let me leave you with something you can actually do, because knowing all of this is worthless if you do not know your next step. First, contact the manufacturers directly before you commit to any design. Steel Master Building Systems and Rhino Steel Building Systems both sell entry-level arch kits and will quote a delivered price to your address. The $650 figure only becomes a real number once it is tied to your footprint and your county, because transport from the nearest distribution point can equal the kit cost in remote areas. Second, call your county planning office before you purchase anything. Ask specifically whether a structure of your planned square footage requires a permit, whether it must be connected to utilities to qualify for the exemption, and whether the county has any restriction on human occupancy of non-permitted accessory structures on private land. Those 3 questions asked in that order. Define your playing field before you spend a dollar. Third, solve the land question before the structure question. An arch shell in a storage yard is not a home. The informal land arrangement, maintenance and labor exchange for replacement agreement with a rural landowner, is a pattern that appears consistently across documented builds in Montana, Idaho, Tennessee, and throughout the rural South. Pursue it before you assume land cost is a barrier. Fourth, budget honestly for insulation from day one. The shell requires $200 to $350 in rigid foam board and a $20 roll of 6 mil vapor barrier to be livable year-round. Both are fixed costs. Neither is negotiable. Fifth, if you intend to sell or refinance anything on the property later, document everything. The build cost, the energy performance, the code exemption basis, and hand that documentation to the appraiser before he reaches for the wrong category. The photograph that accompanies this video shows 2 green corrugated arches on a wood deck at the edge of a spruce forest, doors open, warm light spilling across the interior shelving, a sleeping area just out of frame. That structure was not financed by a bank. It was not approved by a planning committee. It was bolted together on a piece of ground by someone who decided that the default was a choice and not a requirement. And the moment you see the default for what it is, you are no longer trapped by it. If cutting costs, building smarter, and depending a little less on systems that were never designed around your situation is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure the next one of these finds you. That is really all it takes.